In 1944, Patton had the power to execute his own officers. The law called it justice. He called it a waste. So he chose something colder, a punishment that didn't kill the body, but buried the soul. And the men of Third Army would soon learn what Patton feared more than death. August 1944, France. The Third Army was tearing across the countryside like a steel storm, crushing German units faster than Allied planners believed possible. Columns of tanks rolled day and night, towns fell in hours, and Patton's reputation grew with every mile. Then the reports began to arrive. Captains, majors, even a lieutenant colonel. Men who had worn their rank with pride suddenly froze under fire. Some hid in bunkers while their soldiers fought alone. Others stopped giving orders, paralyzed by the sound of artillery and the weight of responsibility. A few simply abandoned their duty at the moment it mattered most. Patton read the files in silence. Under wartime military law, he had clear options. He could convene courts-martial for cowardice. He could charge them with desertion in the face of the enemy. He even possessed the legal authority to have officers executed. The power was real, so was the temptation. But Patton chose something different, something colder, quieter, and in many ways more devastating than a firing squad. He relieved them of combat command. He stripped away their authority. He reassigned them to rear area desks where the guns could not be heard. And he made certain that everyone in the division understood exactly why. For a professional combat officer, this was annihilation, not physical death, but the destruction of identity, of the life they had built around leading men in battle. To understand why Patton acted this way, you have to understand what it meant to be an officer in 1944. This was not peacetime leadership. There were no training schedules, no safe exercises. An infantry officer lived inside chaos, making decisions in seconds while other men's lives hung from those choices. Most handled it. Some discovered courage they never knew they possessed, and some broke. To wear an officer's bars in 1944 was to carry an invisible burden heavier than any rifle. Leadership in World War II was not about clean maps or polished speeches. It was about stepping into streets filled with machine gun fire, making decisions while men screamed, and keeping your voice steady when every instinct told you to run. Most officers rose to that challenge. Some even discovered greatness inside the chaos. But a few discovered something else. Fear. Not the ordinary fear every soldier felt, but the kind that shut down thought itself. The kind that turned trained leaders into silent passengers while their platoons bled around them. For Patton, a broken officer was worse than no officer at all. Soldiers depended on their commanders for direction, for courage, for the simple act of moving forward. When an officer failed, men died, not from German bullets alone, but from hesitation, confusion, and the absence of leadership. Yet dealing with those men was complicated. Many had served honorably before the invasion. Many had families waiting back home. Most were not cowards in the simple sense, just human beings pushed past the edge of endurance. Today we would call it combat stress, or PTSD. In 1944, there was no gentle language for it. The military justice system offered clear procedures. Courts-martial, formal charges, even the ultimate penalty for cowardice in the face of the enemy. Patton had used that system before. The infamous slapping incidents in Sicily proved how fiercely he judged any sign of weakness. But with officers, the calculation changed. These were not frightened privates. They were West Point graduates, ROTC men, the professional spine of the Army. Public trials would not only destroy individuals, they would question the entire system that produced them. Patton needed a solution that was fast, quiet, and absolute. And he found one. Patton did not move on rumor. For all his reputation as a man of fire and impulse, he was methodical when it came to judging officers. When a report reached headquarters that a commander had frozen under fire, Patton ordered verification first. His staff interviewed other officers in the unit. Senior NCOs were questioned in private. The tactical situation was reconstructed minute by minute. He wanted facts, not excuses, not gossip, not convenient scapegoats. Only when the picture was clear did Patton act. And when he acted, it was immediate. There were no formal charges, No courtroom, no public spectacle. The officer would be summoned to headquarters and led into a small room where Patton waited alone. The conversation was brief. "You are relieved of combat, command, effective now." The officer would try to speak, to explain the confusion, the fear, the artillery, the moment that had broken him. Patton rarely allowed more than a sentence. "The decision is final." Then came the order that ended careers. Reassignment to the rear. Supply depots, logistics offices, administrative desks far from the sound of guns. But the true punishment was not the new job. It was what followed. Patton never announced these decisions officially. He was too clever for that. Yet somehow, within hours, every mess hall and motor pool in the division knew. "Did you hear about Major X?" Patton pulled him, froze during the attack. The word spread faster than any bulletin. By nightfall, the officer was no longer a commander. He was a cautionary tale walking the corridors in borrowed time. For a professional soldier, this was devastation beyond any court-martial. Trials at least offered procedure, defense, the thin dignity of formal justice. Patton offered none of that. He offered exile. To understand the cruelty of Patton's method, you must understand what a command meant to a career officer. Rank was not simply a title, a company, a battalion, a regiment. These were identities carved into a man's soul. Officers measured their worth not by medals but by the trust of the soldiers who followed them into fire. When Patton removed an officer from combat, he did not just change a job description, he erased a life. Execution ended everything in a single moment. Reassignment forced a man to keep breathing inside his own failure. The relieved officer remained in uniform, watching others continue the fight. He sat behind a desk while former peers earned decorations and wrote history. In mess halls, he felt the silence thicken when he approached. Everyone knew. You were the one who froze, the one Patton decided was unfit. One officer, relieved during the France campaign, later wrote words that still echo. "I would have preferred a court-martial. At least there I could have defended myself. Instead, I was simply removed from the combat roster. No explanation, no appeal, no chance to prove I could do better. It destroyed my career and my sense of self." That was Patton's intention. He understood military culture with brutal clarity. Fear of death could be endured. Fear of dishonor could not. By making failure visible without ceremony, he created a deterrent stronger than any legal punishment. Yet Patton was not acting from cruelty alone. His system served hard purposes that courts-martial could never achieve. Speed, trials took weeks. Battles waited for no one. Morale, public prosecutions would shatter faith in the officer corps. Cohesion, formal hearings forced units to relive defeat instead of preparing for tomorrow. Utility, even failed leaders could still manage warehouses and convoys. Above all, Patton needed the problem solved now. The Third Army could not afford hesitant commanders. The exact number of officers Patton quietly removed during the French campaign was never written in official ledgers. That was the point. No paperwork, no scandal, only results. Yet stories survived. A company commander who froze during an assault on a fortified town. His platoon leaders fought the battle while he hid in a cellar listening to the walls shake. Within 24 hours, he was running inventory at a supply depot 200 miles from the front. A battalion executive officer who insisted he needed to coordinate from the rear while his men advanced without direction. His commander reported him. Patton reassigned him to division headquarters to shuffle forms he would never sign again. A regimental staff officer who panicked during an artillery barrage so badly, a sergeant had to physically restrain him from running. Patton sent him to Corps headquarters where the loudest sound was a typewriter. Each case followed the same pattern. Confirmed failure, immediate removal, silent exile. Some tried to salvage what remained. They requested transfers to other armies, hoping for a clean slate where their past was unknown. Patton usually denied them. "You don't get a second first impression in combat," he said. A few were eventually allowed back near the front late in the war, when the demand for officers became desperate. But the mark never faded. They returned as shadows of the men they had been. One of them later confessed, "I understood why he did it. My men deserved better than what I gave them. But living with that knowledge while others fought was harder than any shelling I ever faced." Patton's method forced a terrible question. Was this justice or necessity? Patton could have chosen the legal path. Under the Articles of War, cowardice in the face of the enemy was punishable by death. The authority existed. Other armies had used it. British firing squads had ended careers and lives for less. On paper, the solution was simple. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Legal complexity proving cowardice was never clean. Defense officers would argue combat stress, confused orders, impossible conditions. Trials would drag on while divisions waited for leadership that never arrived. Public scandal. Imagine American newspapers printing headlines about U.S. officers executed by their own army. Families would write to congressmen. Politicians would demand inquiries. The enemy would feast on the propaganda. Morale damage. Enlisted men would wonder who had chosen such officers in the first place. Confidence in the entire leadership system could crack at the worst possible moment. Time lost. Every hour spent in courtrooms was an hour not spent planning attacks. Patton was fighting a war measured in minutes, not legal briefs. Most important of all, execution did not serve his goal. He did not want revenge. He wanted effective command. Killing a failed officer removed a problem, but did not create a solution. Reassignment allowed the Army to keep useful administrators while clearing the front for men who could lead. As Patton told his staff, "Courts-martial are for criminals. I'm dealing with unsuitable personnel. Cold, practical, relentless." Patton's system worked. The Third Army kept moving. Morale stayed high. Failed leaders disappeared before they could cost more lives. But effectiveness does not erase doubt. On one side stood the officers who were removed. Men denied the basic rights their own army promised. No formal charges, no defense, no appeal. Just Patton's judgment and a one-way ticket to the rear. From their view, it was profoundly unfair. A single terrible hour defined an entire life. On the other side stood the soldiers who followed them into battle. Those men did not need legal philosophy. They needed leaders who would stand when bullets came. Patton believed the balance was clear. The right of a private to competent leadership outweighed the right of an officer to procedural comfort. A platoon deserved courage more than a captain deserved paperwork. And yet the question refuses to die. Is efficiency enough to justify injustice? The officers kept their pay, their uniforms, even their lives. But they lost the only thing that mattered to them, the chance to prove they could lead again. Perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps it was cruelty disguised as pragmatism. The truth sits somewhere between. August 1944. Officers who had worn their bars with pride found themselves erased from the war in a single afternoon. Patton could have signed death warrants. The law allowed it. Instead, he chose a punishment that lasted far longer than any execution. He let them live with their failure. No trial, no appeal, only the quiet sentence of exile. It was brutal. It was arguably unjust, and it was devastatingly effective. The Third Army never slowed. Units kept faith in their commanders because the unfit were removed before hesitation could spread like infection. Patton valued one principle above all others. The soldier's right to survive outweighed the officer's right to defend himself. Whether that was moral depends on how you define morality in war. Courts measure fairness. Battle measures outcomes. Patton lived in the Second World. He understood that in combat, process can be a luxury. Men do not die politely while lawyers argue. Leadership must be decisive even when justice is blurred. So he chose speed over procedure, protection over pity, victory over reputation. The officers he relieved paid a terrible price. They watched history move without them, carrying a shame heavier than any medal. Patton gave them life, just not the life they wanted. And that, to a warrior, was the cruelest mercy of all.